So yes, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you all to the afternoon enology session where we'll be discussing and exploring vintage variation within the winery and how as Oregon winemakers and grape growers we respond and adjust to differing vintages. We of course see vintage variation as integral to what makes Oregon such a special grape growing and winemaking region, but we also see this session as a nod towards the reality of climate change, with the increasing incidence of warmer seasons and earlier harvests. My name is Michael Davies. I'm the executive winemaker at Rex Hill and A to Z Wineworks, and I'm also joint owner of a nano brand called Matzinger Davies Wine Company with my wife Anna, and we have two wines, the fifth and the sixth wines from that company. My job today is both moderator for the session, wrangling the three panelists in front of you, but also to present as a panelist myself a little bit later. I've got a couple of housekeeping notes before I introduce our esteemed panel. There's clearly a tasting component to the session. I think you should have noticed it by now. I emphasize the word tasting. So Brian Croft, David Adelsheim, and Russell Gladhart, there's no refills, all right? There should be 3 pairs of wines in front of you, or 6 wines in total, and the placemat describes the wines by producer and vintage. We encourage you to taste the respective pairs of wines while the corresponding winemaker is speaking. And lastly, I ask you to jot down any questions you may have about the wines, to have them answered later during what we hope will be a robust Q&A session and discussion towards the end of the session. So today, in speaking order, we will be hearing from none other than Steve Price from Price Research Services and ETS Laboratories, a regular on the stage. It's hard to get him off, in fact. Steve is a foremost expert on tannins and phenolics, and I personally have had the pleasure of working with Steve for many years at Rex Hill and A to Z. I always appreciate his depth of experience, his perpetual curiosity, and his dry and somewhat, dare I say it, tannic sense of humor. He also owns He also owns a beautiful vineyard, for those of you who don't know, located just outside Monroe, Oregon, called Sunny Mountain Vineyard, and he is always conducting trials there to scratch his latest itch, that scientific itch, that is. Today, Steve will be presenting observations and the results of some of his recent vineyard experiments, and I believe they will challenge some of our conventional wisdoms on yield. Next, we have Isabel Mooney, co-founder and winemaker of Lavinia, a native of Quebec. Isabel is a highly accomplished and well-traveled winemaker, having trained in Dijon, France, and also at Lincoln University in New Zealand. From my perspective, Isabel's arrival on the Oregon wine scene in 2007 coincided with a new, broader appreciation for freshness, intensity, and purity that Willamette Valley wines have to offer. According to her husband, Andrew, are you in the room at all? Okay. According to her husband, Andrew, Isabel is also one of the few local winemakers who can bake a mean loaf of bread and who looks hot in her road bike gear. So I think that's called job security, if Andrew is here. Isabel will be speaking to both her philosophical and applied approach to winemaking in the light of certain vintages. We'll then be hearing from Tony Reinders of Tendril Wines, Tour de Force Wine Company, and Tony Reinders Consulting. Tony has a long and distinguished, although he might say sometimes checkered, history in the Oregon wine industry. Some would say he is the godfather of Oregon white Pinot Noir wines. He has worked in numerous wine regions of the world and was a Davies grad, if you can believe it, back in 1992. Never one to hold back on his opinions or to hesitate in striving to make the highest quality wines. Tony, to this day, is still considered eye candy to some in this industry. We will be hearing Tony's general approach to winemaking in response to different vintages and how his winemaking has changed over the years. Now, what I'd like to do now, before I hand over to Steve, who's an old hand at this, I de-emphasize the word old, but I'm going to present some climate data to set the table or set the tone of the session. This climate data is courtesy of two very important and smart people in the Oregon wine industry, Harry Peterson-Nedry of Chehalem and Greg Jones of Southern Oregon University. Harry and Greg both share the real ability and passion to gather and synthesize a lot of data and then to interpret it and to present it to folks just like us. So here we have one of Harry's favorite and famous graphs showing the different vintages over the last 30-odd years. You can see to the right-hand corner, there's a long base period there from 1961, I think it is, through 1990. My glasses are failing me. But you can see over to the left-hand side various recent vintages and how they compare to each other in total growing degree days. One thing I want to draw your attention to is 2016 is the furthest most line when you look at the middle of the graph. So in other words, we came out of the gate incredibly fast. It was a warm start to the year, and that makes all the difference in Oregon. But by the end of the season, it was cooler than, as you can see, both 14 and 15. So you can see some other years in there. Let me blow that up a little bit more to give you a bit better visibility. So anyone who's questioning whether we've had some warm vintages, you can just see if the long-term trend 61 to 90 is the bottom right, you can see how 2010 and 2011, somewhat recent cooler vintages, moderate, and then a whole variety in between there. Moving on, we've got some growing degree day charts from Salem. Data goes back pretty far. Greg's a resourceful guy. 1893. Looks like it was a very cold vintage. I'm pleased I wasn't trying to grow Pinot Noir in 1893. I think the most important thing on this graph to see, and you'll see it in the subsequent graphs too, is how from the long-term average there, we have come up decidedly by 10% in those last 20 to 30 years. If we look at the last 10 years, we're at another 10% higher again. So it's a pretty significant warming phase that we're in. But what struck me when I saw this was actually how in the 40s and the 50s we had some warmer years as well. So that's Salem. Then we get to Roseburg. Doesn't go back quite as far, 1931. The scale is different on all these graphs, so it's more about the relative relationship than it is anything else. But you can see the same sort of relationship. So whether it's the Willamette Valley, whether it's Roseburg, whether it's Medford, there's the same pattern of approximately 10% increase in a short period of time. So that's Medford, and then for any Washington people in the room, there's some data from Kennewick. So the trend's pretty clear with these graphs. What I'm looking forward to you hearing today is from these three people here, how we address this reality. Now we get to the water. What about precipitation? This graph shows annual precipitation. As you would expect, pretty variable. I want to emphasize this is annual precipitation. It is not growing season precipitation. So for example, look at this in the red on the right-hand side. Most of us think of 12 as a dry vintage and 13 as a wet vintage. The exact opposite. 12 by historical data is above trend line and 13 is way below. Here's another example of some temperature mean and extremes. I just compared 2 years, 2010 and 2015. 2010 was, of course, one of our coldest on record in recent memory. 15 was one of our warmest. I think what's useful here is to look at the difference in the means between those years. We're decidedly 10 degrees warmer in those early spring months. You then look at the totals of the days above 80 degrees and 90 degrees. 100% difference, the number of days above 80 in 2015 compared to 2010, and the same and even more days above 90. Look at the peak temperatures too. In 2015, we're up at 106 and 103, whereas back in 2010, we're only at 96 and 99. Rainfall, I only want to highlight this again because we can get so fixated on the rainfall during the growing season, but you compare those, there's not a huge difference. The difference is not many people in 2015 still had grapes hanging out there in October. So now we go to Steve. Oh.
Hey. Just to set the record straight, I look pretty good in my bike gear as well. All right, I didn't quite get the session title. I'm talking about Vineyard Variation. I've never quite tuned to what's going on. But I thought I'd talk about some of the tools and some of my ideas about why the recent changes we've seen in recent vintages are so important to what we do. And I think my main message I want to get across is, as an industry, I think we're better equipped with our tool set to deal with a cool vintage than a warm one. So this is harvest. I'm going to show you this picture multiple times, but there is a lot of vintage variation in Oregon. Harvest in 2011 in November, harvest in 2016 in September 18th. There are greater extremes than that. There was fruit picked in 2016 in August. We're looking at some very different vintages in recent years. The causes of vintage variation, by far, I think the most important is spring heat units. How much heat are we getting early in the season? With spring heat units gives us variation in bloom dates, and that directly relates to variation in harvest date. That's, I think, obvious to most people, but it can't be overemphasized in a discussion of vineyard variation. Weather at bloom, a major factor affecting fruit set, which in turn affects cluster morphology, which has a big impact on phenolic components, and the crop load. Weather pre-harvest, we're all pretty tuned to that one. Dry or rainy, are we going to get dilution, concentration, or disease? Those are major variables. They change every year. Heat spikes. 2015 is the classic example of that. High temperatures, we get sunburn, and we get loss of anthocyanins with an impact on final wine composition, particularly tannin. There's multiple other variants in here, but I would make the case that almost all of them go back to heat units in the spring. They determine when harvest is going to be, therefore the likelihood of harvest rain. They determine when we're going to pick, therefore the likelihood of bird damage, disease. It just goes down the line. And we're not alone in this. This is data from Sonoma showing the heat units in February, March, and April for the past 5 years. And what's disturbing is to watch it get earlier and earlier. It takes Pinot Noir about 550 heat units to come into bloom. And this data suggests, and it in fact happened, that in Sonoma the last 2 years, Pinot Noir bloom started in April. So they start in April, that means they're picking in July. Here's some Oregon data from the Willamette Valley showing one vineyard block picked by one winery from the last 9 years, showing the relationship on the bottom of date of first bloom and date of harvest. That's a pretty tight relationship. Basically, there's bloom date, there's June 17th, that's 2012 data right there. But what's interesting is the regression analysis here. It's a very tight curve. R squared of 9.98 means that 98% of the variation in harvest date can be explained by variation in bloom date. We're set up before we even get started. Here's the data, 2009, 10, and then here's the scary part. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Here's the same data, it's just expressed on a table because there's an interesting point here. Here's the bricks at harvest. This particular winery has a sensitivity to high alcohol. They don't want to pick at high alcohol, at high sugar. They don't like to add water. So they're pretty much limited. They have to pick at 24.5, 25 at the latest. But when you look at days from bloom to harvest, how much time have those grapes had to ripen? In the warmer vintages, they're having to pick earlier in the grape's development process at a different point in the grape maturation cycle. So we're set up. By the end of bloom, we've got our harvest dates set, we've got crop load set, our vigor from soil moisture, the potential tannin is set. The botrytis pressure is already clear. The likelihood that we're going to have a problem with botrytis, either by late harvest or very good fruit set, and bird damage. I mean, all of this is set up by the time we end bloom. right past that. So we should be set at that point with a set of tools for the vintage. So what are they? Well, I think we have a lot of them on cold vintages, but one of the things that I still don't see the industry doing is trying to delay sugar accumulation, and by doing so, extending hang time, moving that 100 days to 110 from bloom to harvest. Short canopies, this is an extreme example from 2005. Here's an example from 2013. I've done this trial over and over again. This one is this was last year, 2015. I only cut off about 8 inches of the canopy. I did it at 18 Brix and still got a 1 degree Brix delay. Those new young leaves on the top of the canopy are extremely potent sugar producers. If you're being pushed by sugar to harvest early, you really ought to consider something like this. It's not done very often. And there's the potential to do it with antitranspirants if you want. You can spray antitranspirants on the top of the canopy. Antitranspirants form a film, plug up stomates, interfere with photosynthesis, and can delay sugar accumulation without impacts on phenolics. None of these trimming trials have ever changed phenolics, but they have changed the picking date, which in turn would change phenolics. What I'd like to see is somebody to do this on a serious wine scale and look at delaying and how that delay results in a better wine by the delay in harvest date. Commercially, I have yet to do that experiment. Here's some experiments I did this year. I love, when I finally decided to buy a vineyard, it was, I've wanted to try all these things, and every year I got something. And sometimes it's the same stuff over and over, and I'm going to show you. So this year I did a cluster thinning trial, a cluster trimming trial, and a damage trial. So the thinning trimming trial, I had full crop, 2 clusters per shoot, no wings. 1 cluster per shoot, no wings. And then I did a cluster trim. So I cut the bottom third of the cluster off. That's been done quite a bit in Europe, primarily to avoid botrytis. It's also been done in New Zealand. This shows trimming effects at various times. The control is none. The 57 is pre-bloom, 73 is right at shatter, and then 77, 79, and 81 go from cluster closure to right before veraison. But any of these trimming are effective in reducing botrytis. A year like 2013 would have been really nice to do this. So here it is showing my handy vineyard worker, Sally, my wife, demonstrating. And we actually did this with the clusters on the vine, but this is just to show you. If you cut it and you look inside, so the picture on the far right, if you can see, I can't point from here, but what you can see in there is the leftover dead flower parts. They're stuck inside the cluster. That's a Botrytis Inoculum in a nice little cage that's perfect for developing botrytis. That's why this works for preventing botrytis. But there's been implication that it also influences phenolic synthesis, and that's what I was really interested in. So here's what I cut off. Full crop, just wings, 1 cluster per shoot, a bunch of fruit. That's half my crop on the ground. This is from 3 vines, so I had 5 replicates of 3 vines. This is what I cut off of 3 vines here to demonstrate how much I'm removing. And then the cut clusters, I'm cutting about maybe a quarter of the crop off. A lot less than 1 cluster per shoot. And surprisingly, it was pretty fast to do. The instruction to accrue is pretty easy. Every cluster, cut the bottom third off. Don't think, just cut the bottom third off. Cut the wing, bottom third. It's pretty fast. It's not a lot slower than 1 cluster per shoot. Okay, I ran a full juice panel at ETS. That's Brix, TA, pH, malate, tartrate, potassium, glue-frou, etc. Yams, and I did a phenolic panel. So a grape extraction, wine-like extract. And what did I find? 1 factor was significant and only 1 treatment. So trimming clusters increased anthocyanins. Dropping half the crop on the ground did nothing. Patty Skinkis has shown this multiple years in her trials in many vineyards. I always thought she wasn't quite doing it right. In a warm vintage, dropping crop is not effective at increasing Brix, nor is leaving crop effective at retarding maturation. I hear both of those. Oh, I'm going to leave 3.5 tons this year to slow ripening. That doesn't work either. Not in a hot year. Interestingly, trimming does. And anthocyanins, they're red pigments, but anthocyanins are very critical for tannin extraction. Anthocyanins help tannin get out of the skin cell walls and into solution. Grapes with high anthocyanins tend to produce wine with higher tannins. And I would expect, had this trial gone into winemaking, we would have seen a tannin response here as well. There's something else that came out of this. This is the data by rep, 5 reps, 3 treatments. But what happened here? How come these 2 reps are lower? Well, this is a hill, bottom of the hill on the left, top of the hill on the right. And if you just ignore the treatments and put the bars in the order of their position on the hill, the first 6 sets have considerably lower anthocyanins than the next. And the difference between those is far greater than anything I did by dropping crop or trimming clusters. This is not vineyard variation, but it's very interesting, especially when you look at tannin, which was also affected, but look at catechin. And look at the catechin-tannin ratio. A huge difference by its position on the hill on what looked to me like a uniform slope. However, we've had 45 inches of rain so far this year, and on a sunny day out in my vineyard, this is the road 4 rows to the right of the trial. You see the wet stops on the tracks there? That lines up exactly with the division between those. This is a soil drainage issue. And my point here isn't that this is vineyard variation, but it's an opportunity to fix something that you can't, when you're having trouble finding some way to make your fruit better, fix the fixed factors. If you've got a problem in your vineyard, you're not going to solve it by dropping crop in the ground. I'm going to solve this one by putting in drainage ditches. It's going to cost me less than dropping half my fruit on the ground. But you know, when you're in a year like a difficult year to improve, look everywhere. Okay, so here's the data from the trimming trial again, just to refresh your memory. Nothing changed but anthocyanins. I did that same trial, at least with the cluster trimming, in 2011. I had a huge impact from cluster thinning, and that's something we have to remember. I influenced seed ripening, tannin, anthocyanins, a much bigger difference in anthocyanins than the trimming experiment. And look at Brix, 2 degrees Brix difference. The difference between picking grapes in the middle of summer versus picking grapes in the fall is something we have to recognize when we're looking at what can we do to improve a vintage. Grapes have a lifespan. They're born at bloom. They live about 110 days. They start to senesce at that point. But where is that occurring in the lifespan of the grapes? Is it happening in midsummer when the grapes are still happy and growing, or is it happening in the end of fall when grape leaves are senescing, day length is starting to play? And as an industry, we're better set dealing with fall harvest than summer. We really have to look carefully at the people in California who've been picking in summer forever. Another thing that I'm interested in is berry thinning. Berry thinning does something different than cluster thinning. If you can't get a response from cluster thinning, maybe you should be doing berry thinning, opening up the clusters. And we did trials. Berry thinning gives you open clusters, less rot, better tannin. And this is kind of what you hope to see, but I did this by berry thinning with a brush, not with a mechanical harvester. When we did mechanical harvesting trials last year, in 2015, this shows the same cluster, and we did get some berry thinning, but by far the biggest response we got was berry damage. And even so, the mechanically thinned treatment had higher anthocyanins by quite a bit than an unthinned control or a hand-thinned control. So what is it about damage? Is it just damage? Is damage important? Is damage doing something to grapes? So I got out my trusty hairbrush, same one I used to thin flowers, and I gave them a whack. That's the next day. They look pretty awful. Not only that, I did this at lag phase, and it just happened to be raining. It looks like a recipe for disaster. But it's early enough in the season, there's no sugar, Botrytis doesn't really get started at that point, and the damaged berries dried up, and I got higher anthocyanins, higher tannin in the damaged berries, a slight reduction in Brix, and these are all statistically significant differences. There's things we're not thinking about. That's my point. I don't think I'm going to go out next year and whack clusters. I might trim. And it demonstrates that phenolic synthesis is a part of the damage repair process, and there's quite a few other things floating around that relate to damage in grapes. I think agrothermal effects are probably related to that, even possibly the yeast products that are being advertised for spraying. I think they may trick the grapes into think they're being attacked, but basically stimulating phenolic synthesis. Okay, I don't have data here, but I would like to mention summer heat, both for its effects on sunburn and for loss of anthocyanins. It's not something that as an industry we're responding to very well. This year I left, you can't see it very well, but if you look at the row on the left, that's the east-facing side of my vineyard. I left it nice and tidy, but on the west side I left it hairy and long. I reduced sunburn this year quite a bit, and I'm losing 10%, 15% last year and the year before to sunburn. That's a lot to lose. This was effective, however, we just pruned this block and pulling the brush was a pain in the ass. But there's other things people can use when it's hot. In California, they mist. People seem to laugh here when you talk about misting. Oh, we couldn't do that, it takes too much water. But they're turning around and irrigating to try to prevent heat damage from irrigation. And I think this is probably a more effective treatment than putting turning on your drip system. Protective films, kale and clay, surround is an effective way to lower leaf temperatures. It's been shown to have no effect on Brix, but to keep your fruit cooler. And shade cloth is now being widely used in Napa. And it's pretty easy. It's not that expensive to put up. Some people leave it out there year round. Some people raise and lower the little curtains. I'm going to be putting in shade cloth the next early season, but I'm going to make that decision after bloom when I find out when we're ripening. So that's it. Just an introduction, some call to action. What do we do in a warm vintage?
Thank you very much, Steve, and now over to Isabel.
Hey, it's there. Welcome, everybody. I am here to talk to you globally about what I do now with Lavinia and the winemaking philosophy globally, and ultimately how that translates in the day-to-day decisions in the vineyards and in the winery in order to embrace vintage variation, because it's part of our philosophy, as you'll know. So Lavinia was started in 2014 with the harvest of 2014, and some people would say that the model is not new, but yet I feel that it's a little bit different than what I would call the typical winery model in Oregon. Usually, most wineries are shaped a little bit like a pyramid, where there's a Willamette Valley blend on the bottom, a few showcased vineyards or specific blocks that are worth doing on their own, and a reserve on top. Quite a few people follow that trend. What we do with Lavinia is just the middle. I think after many years working here and playing with predominantly the one vineyard site, I strongly felt that there was great potential within the industry that was yet slightly untapped at the single vineyard level, and I wanted to help elevate Oregon and help define those vineyard differences and see what we can get and how good we can make wines from those various sites. So as such, the name is pretty fitting because Vinia is Latin and it means made of the vineyard or belonging to wine, and that's all we do. And the winemaking philosophy to embrace the vineyard designate wines that we do is purity and transparency and elegance with insisting on the site. Definitely strive to make each wines a reflection of the essence of the vineyard, but what that means is that it's not only the sites, but it's the conjunction between place, nature, and time, i.e. the vintage. You have to embrace the vintage variation so that you get to learn and play with your sites from year to year. What does that mean in the day-to-day, and when we delve a little bit more, is that the vineyard selection was primordial, and being able to have vineyards with some age was also key to when we looked into doing this as to what sites were selected for this. I wish I could have access to 75-year-old vines, but we're in Oregon, so that's rare, if non-existent. As such, the threshold was about 15 years of age of older with the site selection. It was also making sure that the vineyards are well farmed, that we have great partnerships with the growers to sustainable practices and to farm the vineyards beautifully. In the winery, how do we let the vineyards and the vintage shine? Well, ultimately, the vintage will dictate what I do in the winery. It will dictate whether or not we can leave more crop, or we need to thin it because it's warm or cool. It will dictate whether or not we need to be a bit more pungent with our extraction regime and punch downs, or whether or not you don't need to do anything and those tannins will come out on their own. Ultimately, the vintage, that's how we decide on, the vintage will dictate what I do, but once that's decided, each vineyard is treated the same. So each vineyard that we have in our portfolio will apply those same techniques in order to let the site shine. So gentle and consistent handling between the sites, and ultimately promoting co-fermentation as well. Vine age was important in the site selection, and making sure that each vineyard gets a couple of areas that are complementary to another, so that the wine is a reflection of that vineyard with the hot side and the cold side of the site, or the rocky slopes and the non-rocky slope, so that you have a wholesome picture of that vineyard when you put it on the label, not just the 777 on the south slope over here. So that was part of and we do native fermentations. That's always been although I do yeast my bread, but we do native fermentations in the winery, natural malolactic, unfiltered and unfine, and down to the oak profile, we're consistent. If the vintage dictate that we put 25% new oak or 40% new oak, the mix of cooperage and down to the forest and the toast level will be the same across the wines that I make. That's my new challenge, making great wines while limiting our thumbprint. A little bit of a case study with 2014. I started in 2014. I wish I could compare and contrast between 14 and 15s, but the latter is not yet bottled. Nonetheless, I'll make hopefully some comments, and during the discussion we can talk about that. I invite you to taste. I said, Doc, you've been patient enough. This is great. The 2014 vintage was a great vintage to start a new brand. I couldn't have been happier. It was warm, as we all know. Those are my thoughts on what the vintage was like and how we tackled it. So we have a relatively warm winter and enough rain to warm up the soils and create the perfect environment for growth. And that led to an early spring. Early bud burst, warm spring, 2 weeks ahead of normal, no frost issues. We got a few rain events during the growing season, meaning June, July, August. There was not that much drought stress. I didn't feel that we needed to be concerned about overly dry weather. Ultimately, the warmer than average temperatures kept the vineyard and a few welcome rain events here and there kept the vineyards growing at a steady pace, and potentially I felt like the vines were almost too happy, and where sugars was racing ahead of the overall ripeness of the grapes, and photosynthesis was always at its optimal. Bloom was in early June at the sites that I work with, and there was that week some random isolated showers which produced good set, but there was some hens and chicks in a few of my sites, so there was some differences from site to site from that. So how did we tackle the 14 vintage? Well, promoted leaf coverage to minimize extensive sun exposure, akin to what Steve was saying. Promoted slightly shorter canopy heights. I do like to play with canopy heights when I can, and late hedging to balance out that extreme photosynthesis. We took great care with the green harvest to even out the crop, and I have a note here about wings or no wings, because in a warm vintage that seems to always be a question, like do we leave the wings, do we take them down? We can talk about that later. I'm in the no wings camp, but we'll talk about that later. It'll give us room for discussion. The harvest was condensed for us a bit later, numbers-wise. I picked up, and you'll see those numbers on the wines that you're tasting in the next slide or two. But a bit later, numbers-wise, I felt like sugars was ahead of ripeness, and I needed to wait for the rest to come a little bit together. Picked between the 15th and the 23rd. In the winery, everything is hand-sorted, hand-destemmed. The vintage dictated that we held pick fraction in cold soak. I was talking about having complementary blocks within the vineyard. Well, they don't get picked on the same day, so you have to hold the first pick for the other blocks to come in, and then we co-ferment the vineyard cuvee. So the blending doesn't happen in barrel, it happens as fruit in a fermenter, and we create that single vineyard. The fermentation strategies included a shorter cold soak, didn't feel that we needed to extend it in 14. Medium extraction, didn't feel that we needed to work on these vats a little bit. I didn't feel like the tannins were readily available. So we did regular punch down, some early pump overs, longer post-ferment time on skins than what I typically do, again, because I felt like we needed those tannins to come together in 14. Some nutritional additions, site dependent, because to promote the native ferments and healthy ones, no saignée, no water back, no enzymes, blah, blah, blah. Ultimately, when we pressed the reds, we're gentle and we combined the free run. And that vintage, we chose 30% new oak. And again, that oak profile between the two wines is exactly the same. So the first wine is Tualatin Estates. I tried to pick two wines that were the most extreme within our portfolio. Tualatin Estates is the oldest vines that we have. It was planted in 1974. It's also, here are the nitty-gritty details, a very low site. It spans from 350 to 900 feet, but our blocks are at the 350 feet level. It's very low density, 12 by 6. Ultimately, the wines in the glass is relatively light. It's light in color, yet it has great complexity of flavor. And it made me wonder if that wine was going to be successful in our markets, because as a winemaker, I love lighter wines. It doesn't mean that the consumer loves lighter wines. Sometimes they're looking for something more. And what I've found so far in a handful of months that we've been in the markets is that having the complementary set is interesting, because in California, Tualatin Estate is not our best seller, but in New York it is. Depending on the market, you have a wine for different people. When I was talking about the harvest data being a little bit later than I like, you can see that 23.8 bricks on that wine, 5.2 TA, yet the malic was high and the yans were good. So that's an interesting contrast to the next wine, which will be organically farmed Nisa. Perched high on the Dundee Hills, it's at 750 feet in elevation, so we have and it's also an eastern exposure. Tighter density, 7 by 5, it's farmed organically. So Nisa is a great contrast to this first wine because it's more powerful. It's also as high as I would want to go today as far as elevation is concerned for still wine. It feels like that target is moving, but we'll see. And ultimately, the harvest data is very, very similar. 23.7 bricks, 5.5 TA, also relatively high malic for that TA and that brick level, but the wines are different in the glass, which is the interesting part and which is the quest, and which is to make those and embrace what we have each vintage. That's about it. I'll leave time for questions. I'll pass the baton to Tony.
Thank you, Isabel. And just to remind everyone, please don't forget your questions. It's just that we're going to ask for all the questions later in the session. So now we're over to Mr. Tony.
Good afternoon, everyone. I apologize in advance for my rather croaky voice. I'm still working through a little cold. I have to admit, when I first saw the title for this, I had a little chuckle because to me, it seems like something's missing, maybe a little phrase at the end when you talk about embracing vintage. Here in Oregon, I don't think you have much of a choice here. So if you're not going to embrace vintage here, then to me it should read, or move to California. So, with that said, I think that vintage is kind of a crazy topic. Something that I look at each previous vintage and then coming into the next one. I don't think I've seen the same. Well, I know I haven't seen the same vintage twice. There's usually some shared characteristics, but it seems like it's just becoming that much more of a challenge. And probably one of the biggest challenges I think that we kind of look at each and every year. Just a quick show of hands: how many people think that climate change is real? That's good. You can all stay. Thanks. Some people don't, and that just doesn't make any sense to me. But I would have to say I've been fortunate. I've been able to be in this industry for a number of years now. I've been making wine for about 25 years. Started in California, then did a little time overseas. Then came up to Oregon, went up to Washington, came back to Oregon. So spent most of the time here. But I think really being here in Oregon, it's given me just a really great appreciation for what vintage is and really what you can do with it. And I feel like I'm a much different winemaker now than I was when I started, and I feel like the best is yet to come. So it's really invigorating for me. And it's a challenge, but it's one that I welcome, and I'm here because I want to be here. So no one's holding a gun to my head, which I think is at least it's a good fit for me. And I would have to say that probably the thing that sticks out to me the most, as far as where I've kind of gone to or where we're at currently, is the whole idea of adaptive winemaking. And so what I tried to do. When I started Tendril, which was in 2008, is I wanted to actually have a platform or a lineup of wines that ultimately were different than what I thought was being shown out, from other brands. And so it took me a number of years to get there, about 4 years actually. And so now what our format or our look, I guess, is as far as a lineup is what really amounts to a 5-course meal built around Pinot Noir. So it ranges from, jokingly about the white Pinot, but we do a white Pinot. And then all the way on the other end of the spectrum is 100% whole cluster Pinot Noir, red Pinot Noir, and kind of, some things in between. So there's really a progression with the wines. And, everything that we've done to this point, and I'm using Tendril as the vehicle. I make some wine for some clients, some really wonderful folks, but I'm just going to kind of keep the focus on Tendril today. But it's wonderful because when I have people come and experience the tasting, they really see that range, and it's really something that I think we can do here, and I think we'll be able to do into the future, irregardless of vintage. And so we've kind of built the program in that fashion so that we have the flexibility to be able to navigate around it and not really be too heavily weighted on the single vineyard model, which is completely what Isabel's doing. So part of the reason I'm here, I guess. I love single vineyard wines. I love to do them. But I find that personally, a lot of them for me, every year maybe is not the right year to do them. And so if indeed they are done every year, the challenge is to really make sure that those wines are unique and complex and really have the personality to kind of warrant that individual bottling. So now, getting back to adaptive winemaking, I guess one of the things I wanted to say is that it's taken me some time to kind of figure this out, but I think not overreaching is really important as far as our approach as winemakers. And by that I mean, if we have a cool late ripening vintage, you shouldn't really have an expectation of making a wine that you could in a warm, earlier ripening vintage. And I think embracing what's beautiful about that vintage and really having that manifested in your wines is, to me, it's very important. It's appropriate because it's something that, again, is real, and the cooler vintages will be coming back. So I feel like there's kind of a swing. Just looking, as a quick little synopsis: 2011, 2012, and 2013. Quick show of hands. Who was here making wine in those years? So quite a few. those are like three pretty crazy different vintages, and I mean, there really wasn't a whole lot that was in common between any of them. And so I found that those three vintages really kind of kept one on one's toes. And it was just, it really like reinforced the whole vintage concept, I guess. So with that said, there's a couple of wines in the glass. I probably need to move this little clicker here. I don't have a bunch of information on these slides. I actually repurposed this, so I apologize for not having anything fresh here for you. But really importantly, what we try and do is, we put together a portfolio of vineyards that give us the flexibility. I mean, the vineyards really mimic in our lineup, kind of like paints on a painter's palette, I guess, in a way, where each vineyard represents maybe a unique color. And so that gives us the ability to be able to sort of navigate through some of the challenges of vintage. I would say that I don't want to certainly negate vintage, but importantly, I really refuse to be held hostage by the fact that we have vintages. So there's a way of moderating it. And so that's really what we try to do. And so the two wines that are in the two middle glasses here, I think it's 2A and 2B, are two representations of wines that we make. So these are from the dreaded, horrible, terrible, very bad 2013 vintage that we really kind of like. So this is actually, the first wine is Extrovert, so that's actually the first year that we've utilized that name. That's our sort of first course red Pinot Noir, I guess, for lack of a better descriptor. And then Tightrope, which is really what amounts to our reserve bottling. So contrast in styles, the Extrovert is much more red fruited. It's very pretty. It has some nice floral elements to it, a little brighter acidity so that it actually pairs up with foods that maybe are not so heavy. And then the Tightrope is definitely more structured. Whole cluster is something that we've really come to embrace. Starting in the 2011 vintage is actually the first year that we attempted 100% whole cluster fermentation in our cellar, and it seemed like exactly the wrong year to do it. So that's part of the reason that we did do it, and it turned out fabulously for us. So it was something that we found, very counterintuitive, but something that was intriguing. So it's a tool that we like to use. The Tightrope has about 30% whole cluster. The alcohols on these land, probably in mid-high 13s, which I also like to see. Anything below 14 kind of makes me smile, makes me a little happy. Because a lot of years it's hard to achieve that. And I think, they show a little bit of the peacock display that we are seeking to achieve with our lineup. And I think really with that, I'll probably just kind of pass it off to Michael here so that we have a little time at the end. But please ask lots of questions if you have them.
So I'm shocked. We are way ahead of schedule. We were so concerned, all of us, about being way behind schedule. We're actually a good 5 to 10 minutes ahead of schedule, which, as Tony just said, is fantastic news because, again, it means we can answer more of your questions. So I'm bringing the ship home, so to speak. I have to, jump through a few of Tony's slides. That's all right. So I'm really now want to speak a little bit from a winemaking perspective for A to Z, where I work, and our approach to vintage variation. A little bit different than both Isabel and Tony. For A to Z, you think about that wine, you see it everywhere. You see it in supermarkets, you see it, in every state of the union, for example. When it comes to vintage variation, we want to be in Oregon. We're an Oregon company. We've got an Oregon identity. But we have to be very careful with our wines that when they're on a supermarket shelf and we've got a consumer buying that bottle of wine year after year, there's no one there to explain what makes a nuanced vintage difference. They can't hand sell in the supermarket. The same thing if our wine's been poured at, let's say, the Olive Garden. The server at the Olive Garden probably is not going to know what 2013 in the Willamette Valley was like compared to 2014. So for A to Z, we've got this challenge, our mandate, shall we say, is to actually, and Tony touched on this a bit too, is to somewhat mitigate the vintage variation. And we do that by various means. Our stylistic intent for all the A to Z wines, and for those of you who are not familiar, we make a Pinot Noir, a Pinot Gris, Chardonnay, a Riesling, and a Rosé. We know they've got to be pretty New World in style. They've all got to have plenty of fruit, they've got to have good acidity, they've got to have a moderate alcohol level. We can't afford to have them over 14% alcohol. And because they're going to market early, we want them always to only have a moderate structure. We can't wait for these wines to be solid. So, as I said, we cannot have dramatic year-to-year variations. We need to work and find ways to mitigate vintage variation, and yet and the three main ways we do that, the three main levers that I think is true for Isabel and Tony and others, is thinking about pick date, thinking about crop load, and then thinking about juice amelioration. As I said before, we're very aware that our consumers aren't paying that much attention. The number they're probably paying least attention to, or the thing they're paying least attention to us on the label, is often the vintage for A to Z. Saying all that, we've got no intention of ever resorting to a recipe and relegating the A to Z wines to a generic beverage. We want to have them always at a consistent quality, and we achieve this. Our primary means of achieving this consistency of quality is by sourcing fruit from across the entire state. So we get fruit from the Rogue, the Umpqua, the Columbia Gorge, the Illinois valleys. We'd even look at parts of Oregon, parts of Walla Walla if there was more Pinot planted up there. Those regions, you all know what those climates are like. You've visited those parts of the state. They work for us as buffers to each other. So in a cool year like 2010 and 2011, where I remember at the Rexall Winery waiting for Steve's fruit in 2010 and 2011, there was a lot of nervous winemakers in 2010 and 2011. It was the question of how low was our natural alcohol levels going to be, rather than how high. It was a question of how ripe would the flavors be. By us sourcing fruit from Southern Oregon and the Columbia Gorge, we buffer those coolest vintages, and by keeping a certain percentage of fruit from the Willamette Valley, we buffer the warmest regions. So we think we've been pretty smart doing that. It also allows us to, in some ways, moderate everything that's going on. We've got enough variables. We've got greater consistency of yield. We all know here in the Willamette Valley, we can have anything from 1.8 tons an acre to natural 3.5, 4 tons an acre. So by going out of the Willamette Valley, we have greater consistency of yield. We have higher yield per acre on average than here in the valley, and some of the growers, and it allows us to negotiate with our growers, long-term growers, a slightly lower price per ton, but then of course they're cropping at a slightly higher tons per acre. So they often come out ahead even compared to Willamette Valley growers. We have greater consistency of ripeness, as I said, and we have lower disease pressure. It's no coincidence that in 14, 15, 16, I don't think we've been talking lately much about botrytis in the cellars. We've been talking more about how to manage alcohol levels, how to have balance, how to create ageability in wines. The downside of going out of the region, out of the Willamette Valley, I should say, is we are at slightly greater risk of dehydration of fruit, slightly greater risk of sugars getting ahead of flavors, to Steve's point about how do we make sure the hang time is sufficient so that the phenolic development of the grapes is keeping pace with the sugar accumulation. And so in some ways, if we work with 60 plus vineyards around the state and we're seeing this trend of warming vintages, we're trying to internally in the company take the attitude of what can we learn from those warmer regions that one day all of us may have to apply to the Willamette Valley. We always will need to farm with intention, there's no question about that, but we may have different goals in mind. And so as I say on the slide, in what way are these warmer regions of Oregon now effectively the canary in the coal mine for the future of the Willamette Valley? We try to incorporate, of course, being a large company with more resources now than we used to have. We, of course, rely partly on technology to keep pace with the number of variables and the changes that are going on. Sorry, I'm going to go back actually to the lessons. Something I meant to say here is some of the lessons we've learned, for example, is that, at what point, there's a lot of people in the Willamette Valley who have been proud of the fact that we don't need irrigation, but at what point will all new vineyards be irrigated? At what point will irrigation be one of those tools that becomes standard? At what we all like and are very familiar with VSP trellis systems, but as Steve said about not tucking your westmost shoots, at what point are we going to change our trellis systems back to other systems like lyre systems, or like we've been doing at one of our Willamette Valley vineyards, one of our best Willamette Valley vineyards called Jacobart, insert cross arms in there. The cross arms are about 6 to 8 inches long. They allow the canopy to get fatter, and what we've seen is lower disease pressure because there's less canes on canes. There's still better airflow. There's a slightly more shading in a year like 14, 15, 16. And the temperature inside the canopy is correspondingly cooler. We've also played with, and we encourage many of our growers out of the Willamette Valley. Steve mentioned kaolin clays. It's a clay that you spray on the grapes. The first time I heard about that, I didn't like the idea. Clay to me means high pH. What's that going to do to our juice must? We've seen no interaction there. So we've got growers now in the Columbia Gorge and in Southern Oregon at hot sites, and particularly with young vines, where standard practice, we ask them now to apply a late season spray to help protect their fruit from sunburn and or dehydration. We don't want the dehydration, and they certainly don't want dehydration. An obvious thing too is I feel that my time here in the Oregon, I've been in the Willamette Valley since 1999. I feel like it was probably about 2007 that leaf pulling really took off. And in some ways it hasn't stopped. People have got more and more aggressive about leaf pulling. And at what point do we need to get less aggressive about leaf pulling? And when we see in early spring and hot years, do we actually want to leave as many leaves as we can up there? I think there's an obvious question too that none of us have touched on yet, but maybe we'll get to in the context of later with some questions, is how might we farm white varieties different than red varieties? I think I hear many more people talking about not pulling leaves for white grapes than red grapes. Okay, so getting back on track here, technology and how we have incorporated it into at A to Z. I remember doing a session here a few years ago where we talked about machine harvesting or mechanical harvesting, and people then in the Willamette Valley, I think, still had a bias towards, well, that's a cheap way to harvest fruit, that's an inferior way to harvest fruit. But the reality is the scale of the industry now and the number of wines that have been trying to be produced at less than $20 a bottle, mechanical harvesting is here to stay. And I'm very happy to stand up here and say to all of you that there's some real positives about machine harvesting. You've got to have the right operator and you've got to have the right machine. But there's some benefits. I would prefer any day a machine harvester that can pick your fruit on the day you want, and maybe even at night when it's nice and cool, compared to not being able to get a picker at all. That fruit on your vine on a hot day, waiting a week, is no fun. We all know that. Pleasure. You're welcome, Flo. So, yeah, I think mechanical harvesting is part of the future. It's not for everyone, of course. Never will be. For the highest price point wines, maybe it never makes sense. But for those less than $20, $30, maybe even $40 bottles of wines, why not? If you're getting the fruit into your winery when you want it, in better condition, and you get a free cold soak on the journey. Gelatin floatation, something else that maybe I'm stretching it by calling that a technological thing, but that is something that I feel like in the last 3 to 4 years, which has coincided with these warmer years, something that a lot of the larger wineries in Oregon are starting to do now as standard practice. For those of you who don't know what that means, gelatin floatation is when you bring the white grapes into the winery, whether they're hand harvested or machine harvested. You press them, of course, to separate the liquid. And instead of settling the juice using temperature and enzymes and time to create clarity of clear juice and leaves, you basically add an enzyme, which is a pectinase enzyme, and then you use a gas, you bubble a gas through, and it floats the solids out of the juice, leaving behind the clear juice. The beauty of it from our perspective, and I think many other larger producers are doing this, the beauty is that you can bring your fruit in, and within 6 to 9 hours, you can be fermenting that juice. So you've got no downtime. Compared to when we used to, just a few years ago, we would cold settle everything. You burn 2 days getting it down there, you use a lot of energy, and then guess what? You're ready to inoculate, and you've got to warm it back up, and you've used energy on both sides of the equation. And during that process of cooling it and warming it, you sometimes see EA. Whereas with gelatin flotation, we found that we've had cleaner juice as a result. A couple other things I list here, minor, but at our scale are becoming more and more significant. When we see a warm vintage coming down the pipe, we think hard about what yeasts we're going to use. We don't just plan the same old yeast as we always did. We might use in a hot year a yeast that's going to accentuate brighter, fresher notes. In a cool year, we might be looking for the yeast that give us a lot of texture and richness to a wine. And then there's the other forms of technology, of course, when we're, that I think we all have to be willing to decide when we're going to use it in the future. We had in 2013, I think it was, I'm sure the A to Z team at the back there could remind me, 2013, we had a lot of forest fires, of course, here in Oregon. We had a number of wines from Southern Oregon that had distinct smoke taint. And it showed up at a low level in our rosé, and it showed up at a low level in our Pinot Noir. At any higher level, we would have had to treat it with reverse osmosis to help mitigate that smoke taint. As we get these warmer, drier seasons, we're going to have more forest fires or grass fires, be the same effect here in the Willamette Valley as well. So let's be ready. All right, so then the next thing, tooting our own horn a little bit at A to Z. We've been a growing company. We've tried to invest not only in technology, but we've tried to invest in the right people, the best people. So this slide here is an example of when we're working with the number of sites that we do across the state, the number of varieties that are coming in at the same time. So vineyards, varieties, regions, all those things. We can't just be that winemaker out in the field, tasting a grape, thinking deeply, deciding whether it's ready and what we're going to do with it when we get it into the winery. We've got to collect a lot of data. And as you can see here, this is some of our in-house data, the typical sort of data that we'll collect on any of our fruit coming into the winery. Steve would help us with a lot of the phenolics data, either analyzing it or interpreting on the left-hand side. You can see there, though, what that data would immediately suggest to us is on a catechin level, our 2016 is significantly lower than in the other years. Tannin, the same thing. So if we're trying to make a wine, an A to Z Pinot that has got a similar body and a similar mouthfeel, the last thing we want to do is extract the 15 excessively and under-extract the 16. Same thing looking at the juice panel, it's been very useful to know what our yans have been ahead of time. Everyone sort of thinks they want to know about yans, but how many of you really will check a yan as it comes in and then check it again before you kick it off into fermentation? And we see real differences in that number. Glue-free, ammonia, all these things. You can see the variety of data that we're doing, and over time it is giving us this database to tell us how to approach different sites. So I should speak to the two wines. I wanted desperately to pour you two A to Z wines since I've been talking about A to Z. But as I said, you would be tasting two wines that are almost designed to taste pretty similar. So it would be a little bit maybe uninteresting. So we've gone out on a limb here. We're pouring two wines from the Eole Amity Hills that my wife and I make. When we, as a panel, discussed what wines we wanted to show here, it came up in conversation for a couple of us that it would be great to compare 2011 and 2012 because two vintages are diametrically opposed. 2011, of course, if it hadn't been for 2010, we would have been very, very nervous. And then 2012 was a vintage that you wanted on the heels of 2011 because you sort of felt like, right, now I can make the other type of wine. So you've got two wines from the Matzinger Davies label, both the same blend from the same two vineyards. I've got some data there. You can see that the 2011 was harvested on the 3rd of November. You can see the TPA, 2.6, pretty high actually for that year. Pretty modest bricks, pretty low pH, and a high elevation, 700 feet. So a pH of 3, bricks of 20.7. This wine finished in the 13s, so we did chaptalize this wine. You'll notice that we added 75 ppm of sulfur. We used enzyme, Lafarge Grand Cru enzyme, to make sure we were getting some extraction, and we used dry ice, and it was 100% destemmed. We intentionally did a longer cold soak, a higher ferment temperature, and more actions on this ferment. Compared to the 2012, harvested 2 weeks before, higher TPA, 2.9, considerably higher Brix, 23.8, but a pH still a lovely low pH of 3.26, lower amount of sulfur, no enzyme. We didn't feel like there was any need for enzyme. We felt like there was plenty of substrate, plenty of structure, plenty of richness coming from the grapes. And so, as you can see, we made these adjustments in the winery of a shorter cold soak, lower fermentation temperature, and less actions. When you taste these two wines, I was tempted to actually have them poured blind and mix the order up to see if you could guess which is which. But from my perspective, and I think Anna's perspective, in 2012 we were trying to moderate the tannins. In 2011 we were trying to make sure there was enough body. So I hope you enjoy those wines. All right, I think we've got through that part of the program. Now we're ready for some questions. So feel free to ask any question. We may not answer it, but feel free to ask any question, maybe about the wines, maybe about the broader topic, maybe about Steve's data. David's got a microphone here in the room, so please wait until a microphone comes to you so that the whole room can hear your question, and then I will do my best to divert the question to the right person here to answer it. Mr. Tennell.
Sir, I would be interested in the panel's comments on something that Tony alluded to, and that was his experience in 2011 with the whole cluster fermentation and it being sort of counterintuitive.
So my experience up to 2011 had been extremely limited with regards to whole cluster fermentation. I had tried several attempts from friends of mine, cellars and bottlings that I really liked. And actually some of the ones that stood out to me were the ones that came from the cooler vintages because, again, my expectation would be that you'd be adding vegetative characteristics into the resulting wines, which is something that I'm not terribly interested in. So in 2011, when we selected a particular site that was riper for the vintage based on kind of what we were seeing coming in, we made a determination. It also was a site that we had the least amount of botrytis, and when the fruit came in, it was extremely cold, which I think helped to moderate that, and it was very small fermentation. Virtually everything we do are very small fermentations, ranging from about a ton to maybe 2 tons, 2.5 tons, so all very small fermentations. And then the overall approach as far as the extraction, I think, is really important, but it really brought a lot more depth and dimension, and it actually defied my anticipation, which was that this would be the latest wine that would develop in the lineup, so the last one we would release. And in actual fact, it was probably the most forward of any of the Pinot Noirs we made in 2011. Anyone else?
So my question is for Steve, and I just wanted to go back to what you were saying about delaying harvest. I was a little confused as to, you were saying, I think your answer was that you would clip the clusters that would delay the harvest, hedging the top of the fruit, just kind of tactics, your top 3 things that you would do to delay harvest, because it sounded counterintuitive that leaving a heavier crop load did not actually delay harvest.
I liked thinking that particular thought because most people might feel comfortable saying that thinning won't improve crop, but then they'll turn around and say leaving crop will delay harvest at the same breath, and they're the same thing. You're either moving it or you're not. You're changing it or you're not. I think Patty's work has shown year after year that thinning does not reliably change Brix in a warm vintage, and that's certainly what I saw this year. So I'm going to leave 3.5 tons out so we can wait a little longer isn't changing Brix. It's not buying you the time you want. Cutting clusters gives you higher anthocyanins. It had no impact on bricks. I think that's sort of off the subject. But cutting the tops of the canopies very effectively reduces sugar accumulation. And if you're being pushed by bricks to pick, if you don't want to be above 14, if you don't want to add alcohol, if you want to avoid the problems with high sugar, by cutting the canopy, you can delay bricks and wait 3 days, 5 days, a week. And a week is a lot relative to wine style. Anybody that's made sequential harvests knows that the wine you make this week is not the same wine you're going to make later. And in a warm vintage, I think that might be a useful tool. It's interesting that you can do it as late as you can. At 18 bricks, you can still make that decision because there's still active sugar importation going on. And even then, you can still choose to make that decision. You have time. Probably it's a little more effective earlier, but it doesn't take a lot of trimming either, which is the point of my last trial where I really just cut off the tops of the laterals. It's just a way to delay sugar and buy yourself some time, get yourself a few more days from bloom to harvest. Let the fruit get a little riper, let the tannins come out a little easier, which is really what I think I see most commonly with longer days from bloom to harvest.
While we're waiting, I'm just going to jump back to Doug's question too to offer an alternative opinion on whole cluster. Over the last 10 years at Drexel, we've consistently used whole cluster. We have every year we would have, I would say, half a dozen tanks that were 100% whole cluster. In 2010, 2011, 2015, 16, doesn't matter. And I think there's a very prevailing conventional wisdom that the hotter the vintage, the more whole cluster is the right thing to do, and the cooler the vintage, the less it's a good idea. Our experience has been the exact opposite. Our experience is that it really is site dependent when stems work. Stems can add amazing characters to a wine. They can add greenness. They can add, but they can add other things. They can add tea notes and spicy notes. We worked with a consultant a number of years ago, a Frenchman, who encouraged us whenever we were about to harvest to go out and actually chew the stems. As winemakers, we're very good at going out there and biting berries and looking at seeds, but I don't know of that many of us who actually go and chew on stems. They taste terrible, but what you do realize is that there's a real difference. Some are quite aqueous, like aloe vera, some are quite spicy, some are astringent, some are tannic. And I think we've got to approach the whole cluster argument a bit more. Instead of hot vintage, whole cluster's good, cool vintage, whole cluster's bad, I think we need to get more about site specificity. The other thing that I think Isabel touched on about it is, I think it was Isabel talking about whole cluster, is ferment temperature can make quite a big difference to how those stems present themselves. We will often have high ferment temperatures intentionally with 100% whole cluster, and we don't get those green notes. When I've done the opposite, where I've kept the temperature down in the mid-70s, the low 80s, you sort of get more of those green notes. So in a hot year, if you've got ripe fruit that you're sort of trying to bring freshness and coolness to the wine, that may be over 14% alcohol, why not ferment cooler? If you've got a cool vintage where you actually want some more sort of suggestion of richness, texture, density, why not ferment it a bit hotter? The last thing, and then I will sit down about whole cluster, is we're dealing with different things. We're dealing with aromatics coming from whole cluster, and we're dealing with tannins. Obviously, the hotter you go, the more tannins you're going to get. The cooler you go, maybe the less tannins, but the different the aromatics are. So.
I'd like to jump in on that one. Because although most people think of whole cluster as contributing more tannin, it's considerably more whole berry than any other treatment you do in a winery. And as a result, there is always less seed extraction in a whole cluster ferment than a destemmed ferment. So in a year with unripe seeds, it's not out of the question to consider a whole cluster ferment just for that purpose.
Hey. So you showed a picture of your trimming, your canopy trimming, and it looked like almost half the canopy was gone, and then you're mentioning about taking 6 to 8 inches off. So do you have like a rule of thumb on that?
Well, I showed 3 pictures of canopy trimming. The first was half, the next was about a quarter, and the last one was about an eighth of the canopy taken off it. Yeah, okay, I can make a big impact with half, but the point is that you can make an impact just by taking off the new leaves at the very top, the stuff that regrows after hedging.
I want to jump in. I want to jump in on that because in my previous role, I did play along with canopy heights a lot, and that was in 07. I made sure that we hedged about half a foot higher than we normally do above the post. You know, most people hedge and they follow the post. Okay, the post is here. You can play around with that. You can adjust your machine and you can play around with whether or not you want more leaves or less leaves, depending on the type of vintage you have. And I've done that every single year that I've been here. If 07, I hedged higher than normal. 09, I hedged shorter. 10 and 11, I hedge higher. 12, I hedge shorter. I mean, you decide. But just, I've never run the trial. I'm not a scientist. I don't have the control versus the areas that I hedge shorter. Just out of pure instinct, it was okay. Let's leave more leaves. I think we're going to need them, or let's cut it a little bit shorter. But it wasn't half the canopy. It was usually within half a foot, next to a half a foot or less. And I think it's a good technique.
So this is a yeast question. You were saying that in a hot year you want to select a yeast for freshness and brightness, and in a cool year for richness and texture. Can you just give a couple examples of each, please?
I knew someone would do that. So in terms of a Chardonnay yeast, if it's a cool year and we want more texture, I think DB10, DB10 would be a good way to go. For a warm year, when we're trying to keep the freshness, I would actually lean more towards some of the what yeast that are promoted stainless steel fermented yeast. So like an X16 or X5, depending on which white variety you're talking about. VL yeast has been around forever. VL2, 3. If you read the literature, they all promote different things. I think at one point we used to talk about mallet degradation. VL3 is a reliable form, from my perspective, to keep freshness and penury. Keep some green in notes. The downside to some people about VL3 is it can also leave a little bit of residual sugar, which is not always necessary.
The next question's right here. And I'm wondering about if you guys are messing around with just doing lateral pulling versus full leaf pulling. And then a quick extra, if you're letting canopy heights go higher and higher, do you start to worry about shading the clusters because of the higher canopy height in a colder year?
Can I take that? Oh,
Yeah.
well, I'm gonna. Is my microphone on?
Try that.
Is that on? Oh, yeah.
Check.
Lateral removal is a technique that I've often embraced in a lot of vintages with regards to, in huge part, because a little bit on the contrary with, well, I agree with Steve's research that the more light in the cluster, you're going to get higher anthocyanins and other things. This is what you showed, right? Ish. We had extra anthocyanins by cutting those clusters, so there was light in there. Potentially. Ultimately, to make a long story short, I think that it's important. I think that while some light in the canopy is important, some light directly on the clusters is not necessarily as important, and that maybe you will get greater complexity of flavors and aromas if you let it be and not leaf pull so much. I like what Michael said about, leaf pulling is a relatively new technique, and now it seems like it gets more and more extensive all the time. With regards to lateral removal, so some filtered light on the clusters is sort of what I like to see in a vineyard, and removing the laterals is labor intensive, depending on the timing when you do it. It's costly, but you can have a beautiful effect of filtering light through your clusters. With that same idea of filtered light is good, hedging later to keep your apical dominance, and then you hedge later, and potentially hedging higher promotes a little bit more filtered light and a little bit more shading But when you're of a philosophy that that's okay too.
No, I would agree with that completely, Isabel, that anthocyanins need light, but not highlight, not direct light. That cluster I showed of a bleached cluster is exactly what you get in the direct sunlight. The clusters get too hot. Temperature is the enemy of anthocyanins. They need light, but not direct light, and they don't need hot temperatures. And lateral removal is great. I actually don't pull very many leaves anymore. I pull a few laterals, and that's it. And for sure, I try to minimize that on the west side of on the canopy. Tony, you're going to talk about row direction.
Yeah, what's that?
Row direction.
Yeah, no, I actually wasn't, but it's important. Yeah,
Okay,
for sure.
say it.
Yeah. Well, well, a couple of things. I've also had the experience with some vineyards doing very early leaf removal when the shoots are actually still, probably only 18 inches high, where you can actually pinch some of the leaves off. And what's interesting about that is that you don't go back later and do the leaf removal at sort of the traditional time of leaf removal, and so you get actually more dappling effect just naturally by doing that earlier leaf removal. But Steve was talking about row orientation as well. So on my little vineyard, we were able to plant that at about a 17 degree off true north, and it has an absolutely enormous effect on protecting. And these are young plants, and first crop we got was 2 years ago, so right in the midst of these very difficult vintages, certainly for a non-irrigated vineyard on sedimentary type soils. And so, but the result, particularly last year, we had very little dehydration, and we had very little shrivel and sunburning just based on that one simple approach. So if your site allows for it, it's something to really look very long and hard at, because that's a decision that has an enormous amount of impact. The true north-south plantings really lend themselves to the most pressure with regards to sunburning, without a doubt. I mean, and sometimes devastatingly so.
I'd like to comment on the question about canopy height or how high, maybe too high as well. We had a vineyard in the Dundee Hills last year, one of our best vineyards, where we'd stopped spraying because the fruit was through veraison, of course. We'd stopped spraying quite some time ago, but the upper canopy was still growing, and we were seeing active mildew in the upper canopy. We weren't afraid of it particularly affecting the fruit, but it was certainly unsightly. So we came through and did another hedging pass, purely and simply to sort of manage the late season mildew so that we could maximize hang time. We probably, with hindsight, to Steve's point, could have looked at hedging lower earlier and been applying the brakes to the ripening as well at the same time. But I think that, to me, is my experience or my nervousness about the canopy height getting too excessively tall in a cool vintage, is that you lose control from a disease point of view between the upper and the lower canopy, either because it's flopping over and the spray doesn't get into it, or just because of the time that bottom leaf and the fruit came out versus the latest leaf is quite a different age, different time. Over there, David. Yeah.
You get me thinking about, are we talking about the volume of leaves that we pull off, going to Steve's, trying to control the time? Or are we talking about a vine response to trauma? Is it the amount of leaves? Are we dealing with X amount of ability to convert on a surface area? Or we talking about, I mean, it seems like with the vines, they're living things also. And so when you do a trauma to it, there's usually a response. And I'm trying to separate or see if there's a distinction between both of those things.
Well, I'm a fan of trauma. You can see I beat my grapes. But in this case, I don't think that's the answer. I think it's really all about leaf age. Carmo did a lot of work on that. She did her PhD on that. The young lateral leaves are major producers of sugar by the end of the season. If you plot the sugar produced production from a leaf, or its carbon assimilation, if you want to look at it from the other direction, as a leaf ages, it becomes less and less efficient at photosynthesis. So what you have on the top of your canopy are the leaves that have regrown since you hedged. Usually there's not as many down lower because you've pulled them off. And just cutting those guys off, those little ones, one of these little guys will do twice as much as a great big fat leaf. The first picture I showed of canopy trimming, there was another treatment where I pulled all the leaves off the bottom half. That did nothing, but cutting the top half of the canopy greatly reduced Brix. So it's not just trauma, it's getting rid of your active photosynthesis sites, which are younger leaves, leaves that aren't your primary leaves, but rather secondary ones. That's the main effect.
I can hear an association being called the Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Vines, based on...
Bad vines, bad vines.
While we're waiting for another question, I've got a question for the panel, actually. And that it goes back to the graphs at the start of the session, where we're seeing a fundamental shift in growing degree units between in the Willamette Valley and Medford and Roseburg and wherever we are. My question is, the French always talk about terroir and how the site and the vintage and the winemaker works together to make these beautiful wines. So my question is, with a warming climate, how are our Willamette Valley terroirs changing, and are we comfortable with that change? Over to you, Isabel.
Were many of you part of the terroir discussion this morning? Did you attend that? Yeah, so did I. I felt it was important before I stood up here to at least listen to that. You stumped me a little bit. I think that, yeah, growing degree days is one aspect of it, but it's not all. And as such, Tony asked a question of, do you believe in climate change and climate, and ultimately, yeah, I believe in climate change. We're seeing more extremes. But ultimately, when I look at weather data, I tend to think that the devil is in the detail, not in an addition of growing degree days. So the extremes that we see, when we see them, is more important than, don't want to kill the theory, but it's more important to live day by day and realize that, okay, it's mid-July and it's 106 outside. That means that today my vines are completely shut down and didn't do anything. Or it's May and it's 100 outside like we saw last year, which means that we're going to bloom early. So I think the terroir is going to be there. Is the terroir going to be redefined? Perhaps, but as they said this morning, you cannot call terroir out of a whole AVA because there's not enough. It's too different. So.
I'd like to speak to that. In my vineyard, I bought my vineyard in 2002, and I planted up to 800 feet and stopped. I always thought I'd save the top for Riesling or something, but I'm moving up the hill. I'm less afraid of higher elevation. There will be years like 2011 when it's difficult, but even at 800 feet in 2011, I got the fruit ripe, and I think we're going to see an opening of higher elevation sites, and I think they're going to add to the warmer vintages. There'll still be the vintages where you wish you weren't there, but I think we're moving up.
So can we still refer to the Willamette Valley as consistently cool climate? It's a follow-up question.
I think it's a really difficult argument when people come here for the IPNC and it's 105 degrees out, so when we're talking about cool climate. But, I think Steve really touched on a very important point, which is it's really the start of the race for us, and which is really, when does bloom start? And when the race starts, so to speak, it has an enormous impact on ultimately what the set of variables that we're going to be dealing with. And to Isabel's point about the timing, absolutely. I mean, the same thing could be said for rain. 2013, obviously, it was the year of the atmospheric river. We all dealt with anywhere from 8 to 10 inches of rain, a 3-day period of time, roughly. But truthfully, that was like a little blip because it was a warm growing season. we had, a big challenge, but it was shortly lived. And then we had another 3.5 weeks of fabulous weather after that, where you could really, if the fruit was sound, you could have ripened some pretty nice grapes. So and I've seen more devastation from a 1/2 inch of rain than I saw from 8 inches of rain in some sites, So it's really very much, vineyard specific, vintage specific, and I would agree that, higher elevation certainly doesn't hold the same, I guess, aversion that it once did. I mean, there's some appeal there for sure.
I'd like to add that, I go to Steamboat every year, and I go to World of Pinot Noir every year, and I work professionally with a lot of California winemakers. And we should look south. I mean, they've been growing Pinot Noir under the conditions we've been growing it in the last 4 years, for many years before that. They have tools, they have responses. It's very interesting to talk to them about what do you do in a hot year? What do you do when you're picking in July? How do you deal with that? And you can't deny there's great wines coming out of California, and there are some great winemakers down there. Open up your brains. We're not unique.
Yeah, well, I would chime in and say, I always point to, there's a little vineyard in a winery down in Rutherford called El Molino. And so go buy some of their wine and try it, because by rights they shouldn't be there. This is probably a region 4.5 now or something, and they grow Pinot Noir. And you know what? The wine's pretty good. And to me, that gives me a lot of hope that, we got a long time before we're going to actually be in that type of situation. But, you can navigate around it and still be successful. And I think that's, I have people come up to me with some frequency and start saying, you're going to start planting Syrah or Cabernet or something. And not me. Not me.
We're just about out of time, but we have one more question here. So, Chris, no pressure. That'd be a good one.
So with regard to the trial of cutting off the bottom third of the clusters, what do you think the mode of action was to cause the increase in anthocyanins? Was there some sort of dilution effect, or was it the injury or something else?
I have to guess. I think it's partly the damage, but I think it also may be the loosening of the cluster. When I froze all the clusters and then took them apart into berry samples afterwards, and they were distinctly looser. I think they actually probably benefited from less crowding, probably a little more dappled light on the interior of the cluster. But there was also a serious damage event that happened in the midst of that cluster. It's an intriguing concept. It's not hard. It's one that obviously needs to be repeated. But it has been already shown to be a tool for botrytis. The fact that you can do it as late as you can and get a botrytis response makes it look like an intriguing tool for a year like 2013, when you see the monsoon coming and you still have time to respond.
Well, I want to thank our speakers today for a great panel. Please join me in a round of applause, and thank you for your great wines.